Afternoon, everyone. Happy spring to you all. Very glad to be here with you. And we're thrilled to have Indira Henard with us, who is the Executive Director of the DC Rape Crisis Center and a member of the LGW class of 2021, Resilient 21.
Yeah.
And Leadership Greater Washington is the DC region's premier leadership incubator. We bring leaders from around the region together in a class during a year to talk about the region, to get to know each other, get to bond with each other. And when they graduate from that, we get them to meet the other 2,000 members of the organization, of the other members of Leadership Greater Washington, as a way to expand networks, as a way to help solve problems and make this a better region for everyone. So Indira, we're very thankful to have you with us. It is Sexual Assault Awareness Month this month in April. That's why we scheduled to do this in April. So I don't know if you want to, well, before we get into that, let me ask, how are you? How are you doing? How's your health? How's your staff's health? How's everybody's health around you? And how's it going?
Well, good afternoon, Doug, and thank you so much for creating this space. So great to be amongst my LGW family. I'm doing okay. It is busy. It is busy, busy, busy. It is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. We've been busy all month, just raising awareness and raising visibility. This is the last week of Sexual Assault Awareness Month, so it's a powerhouse week, so we're really excited about that. But I'm doing okay. I am trying to take things one day at a time. I'm a little tired, but things are well. My team is amazing. They have shown up in such a monumental way in the midst of this global pandemic, and I'm so proud of them. They're doing well too. We're trying to prioritize self-care and wellness while still executing the mission and doing what needs to be done on behalf of survivors. But thank you so much for asking.
Did you ever get COVID?
I never got COVID. Yay, never got COVID. I literally test myself like every week because I'm living the vaccinated life. I'm out and about. But no, I am knocking on wood. I have not gotten it. So hopefully it will stay that way.
Let's hope. Huh?
Yes.
Let's hope that happens. So talk to me about the DC Rape Crisis Center. Talk to me about how you got into that position and a little bit about your background. Where are you from? How'd you wind up here? And doing what you do.
Absolutely. So I'm originally from Chicago, Illinois. I've been in DC a little over 20 years. So I came to DC for work. This is actually my second career. My first career is policy and politics. I'm a political junkie at heart. I came to DC because I was then working for Senator Barack Obama. And I was working on Capitol Hill, so paying my dues on Capitol Hill, working in his Senate office. When he decided to run for his first presidential campaign, I divided my time between the campaign and the Senate office. And when he won, I decided to do some soul searching. So while I was volunteering on the campaign and working in his office, public service is really important to me. And so I wanted to volunteer. And so I decided to volunteer at the DC Rape Crisis Center and still did that while I was doing all of my political stuff. And instead of going down the yellow brick road to 1600 Pennsylvania, I made a big detour. And I reached out to my volunteer coordinator at the DC Rape Crisis Center at the time. And I said, hey, would love to do this work full time. Do you have any openings? She said, yes. 48 hours later, I was in for an interview. And as I say, the rest is history. I've been at the organization for 14 years. I've been executive director for 6 years. I started out as a volunteer and pretty much had almost every position in the agency. So one of the best decisions I made.
So what was the first position they hired you for? What did you do?
I was the counseling and advocacy program manager. So I was seeing individual clients, group clients, doing our 24/7 hotline, hospital advocacy, all that great stuff.
So did you have any political withdrawal when you shifted focus? I mean, you've spent a career doing things in politics. I spent a career in politics doing things. And it's it's a different sort of thing when you go into the nonprofit sector and shift your focus.
Yeah, well, I'll definitely say the hours are the same, right? So I'm still pulling 16, 17-hour days. I'm trying to get better at that. But I did have some political withdrawal. I'm still very much a political junkie at heart. So what stays on my TV in my house is CNN and MSNBC. And if something major is going down politically, I get texts and phone calls from my political gurus, and we kind of do the analysis. So, I'm not in it, but I'm in it enough to get my political fix. And I know great people in high places, so that also helps.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So this is the 50th anniversary of the DC Rape Crisis Center, LG Leadership Greater Washington. Just celebrated our 35th anniversary. So 50 years.
Yeah.
It's a long time. Long time.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really exciting time for us. I don't know if people truly know what it has taken us to get to 50 years. For those who know my leadership journey in terms of ascending to the role of executive director, it was very challenging. Not too many people thought our agency was going to make it. We were on life support. And the mandate that I got from my board of directors when they hired me was to literally and figuratively save the agency. And so
when you were hired, you were on life support. You thought that
yes.
People thought it wouldn't last that.
Yep.
Wow.
We were on life support. I knew what I was walking into. And I think for me, it was an important legacy. And I was very clear that our work was not done yet. And there was still so much more for us to do. And so my commitment to the board and to the agency and the staff was that I was going to give it my all in partnership with them and the community, and hope we can do a turnaround. And we've been able to do that tenfold. So proud of that.
So for everybody on the call and those who are going to watch it later, what is the work of the DC Rape Crisis Center?
So it is multifaceted, right? So first and foremost, all of our services are free. We provide individual and group counseling to survivors of sexual assault. We also serve secondary survivors. So you may not be a primary survivor, but you may have a loved one or someone who has been impacted and you need support. We offer our 24/7 crisis hotline. We are part of the joint response for the 24/7 hospital advocacy and community-based advocacy program, where a sexual assault advocate will meet a survivor at any point in the community, anywhere, including one's home. In addition to that, we do training and technical assistance. We do public policy advocacy, as well as community engagement and prevention work. Our work also extends national and international. We flew to Lagos, Nigeria in 2016 to open the first rape crisis center over there. We partnered with a group of international NGOs on building out a mobile app for refugee aid workers who were serving survivors. So really proud of the things that we've been able to accomplish throughout our time.
And it's for any sexual assault that you provide support for?
Absolutely, because what we know is that sexual assault sits on the gender-based violence continuum. So it's not this narrow paradigm that we are historically used to. And so it can include sexual harassment and stalking and, various forms of sexual violence, to include intimate partner violence as well.
Do you provide housing for people who've been victimized?
So what we do is that if a survivor is needing a long-term advocate and they're needing housing support, housing resources, we have an advocate who will work with them on either short-term or long-term housing. So yes.
How about if somebody who's in an emergency situation? Do you have a place to just basically remove them from where they are and put them somewhere else to be safe?
Yeah, so a lot of our clients who show up at the hospital, the majority of them need acute emergency housing, meaning they can't go back home or they're homeless. And so we work with our community partners on getting them emergency housing once they leave the hospital.
And the majority of the people that you work with are through the hospitals? Is that how you connect with them?
So we connect with them at multiple entry points. So the hospital, the community, we have people directly call our agencies, people call our hotline. So it really just depends on what that entry point is.
And how many clients do you have a year? I mean, Give us some idea of the scope of this issue in the district.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a result of COVID, the last 2 years, we've seen a 50% increase in requests for services. Last year, we served 450 individual clients, 140 group clients. We served 5,000 people on our 24/7 crisis hotline. That's in addition to the 3,500 callers that we serve that gets transferred to us from RAIN, which is the National Sexual Assault Hotline.
And your group, what are I know individual clients, the group clients, so what is that?
So group clients is if a survivor wants to participate in a support group with other survivors,
Okay.
we offer a variety of support groups for survivors to participate in.
And you're obviously 24/7. Of those 24/7, how many of them are you? How many of the 27 are you doing?
Yeah, well, I think, for me, even though I'm executive director, it's really important for me to have my pulse on what's happening on the ground. And because our agency, we are small but mighty, I also roll up my sleeves. So I take hotline. This past week, I was dispatched to the hospital. So if I'm needed to be on the schedule, I will do that. And truth be told, that's how I started. And I really love doing that. I really love going to the hospital. I really love showing up for a survivor. And it reminds me of just why I started to do this work.
And you mentioned that your clients doubled, or the calls doubled during COVID. What was that like, and how? Just can you give us your thoughts on COVID in general and what it did for your services?
Yeah, absolutely. So COVID has been really challenging for our clients. We have been operating in unprecedented time. We had to pivot very quickly in COVID, and we moved all of our services to a virtual platform. Our staff did a seamless job of that transition. And what we know to be true is that home has not been safe for a lot of people. Sexual assault, domestic violence, intimate partner violence still happened. And so as a result of the tight restrictions that we were enduring early on, folks were being triggered, re-assaults were happening. And so we saw a spike, people wanting to call for support, people wanting to come in and get support. We also know that, sexual violence disproportionately impacts the BIPOC community. And so the majority of our clients come from wards 5, 7, and 8 and sit on the margins. And so in addition to the COVID pandemic, we were also dealing with what I call the double-edged sword of the racial reckoning. And so those two things combined, in addition to the insurrection, because that was a trauma, it's been challenging. It's been hard for our clients.
So we have a question from Lois Frankel about the Me Too movement and what impact that has had on requests for service from your organization.
Yeah, so the Me Too movement, the impact that that's had is that when a survivor is able to bear witness to someone else sharing their story, that gives them courage to possibly share their story. And so at the height of the Me Too movement, we saw all of these high profile cases from Bill Cosby to Jeffrey Epstein. All of those cases were very, very triggering for survivors. And so we saw a lot of disclosures around that. R. Kelly, that trial, which is still going on, the big documentary that was on Lifetime. So every time there's something high profile in the news around sexual violence, we always triple up on staff because we know during that time we're going to see an increase in our hotline because folks are being triggered by what they're hearing and experiencing in the media.
Now you mentioned an uptick because of the racial reckoning that we are seeing. Can you give us a little more on that?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, sexual violence disproportionately impacts BIPOC survivors, specifically African-American survivors. And so the racial reckoning, it really exacerbated the already trauma symptoms that some survivors were experiencing. And so when you're dealing with sexual trauma, when you're dealing with the historical ways in which African Americans have been engaged in systems and just the environment that is our country, coupled with the racial reckoning, those multiple forms of trauma is really, really triggering. And so we saw that on a mental health level. We saw that in terms of the physical reaction that folks were experiencing. And so BIPOC clients experience a extraordinarily impact because of the racial reckoning. And so dealing with their sexual trauma on top of the racialized trauma and whatever other traumas they have, it was a lot, because what we know to be true is that sexual violence is not a single issue, right? Because we don't live single issue lives. And so we have to approach it from the intersections.
So we have a question from someone who, and this is really where the lines I was going through, or the thought I was going through is, how do you take care of you in the midst of all the work? And how do, these survivors are just, it must have been a massive hit. How do they survive? And how do they get through this?
Yeah, so I think I'll start with survivors.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that we always tell survivors is that healing is a marathon. It's not a sprint, right? And there is no quick fix to healing. And so our hope is that when survivors come to the DC Rape Crisis Center, that we are going to give them the necessary tools that they need in order to manage their sexual trauma. But what we also know is that they can always come back. And so we have survivors who have been coming in and out of our center for 10, 15, 20, 30 plus years, because we know how trauma symptoms can show up. And so sometimes people have to come back for what I call a tune-up. And so we provide what I call a healing buffet in terms of creating multiple choice gates to facilitate healing. So what that means in terms of a healing buffet is survivors may want individual counseling. They may want group counseling. They may want both. They may want Reiki. They may want yoga, right? Whatever it is that they need that will help with the trauma symptoms and help them to regain a sense of normalcy and empowerment. That's what we work with them on. And what we tell them is that we are here, right? So once your services end, you can always come back to us, which is what really makes us unique among other things, is that it doesn't matter how many times we have seen you, you can always come back. I think for me, I try to be intentional around my self-care and wellness. Sometimes I don't get it right, I fall short. And I think when I became executive director, my self-care and wellness looked really different than when I was a frontline staff member. But what I can say, Doug, is that I have an amazing group of friends and colleagues who hold me accountable in love, who show up for me, support me, cover me, love me, and they remind me, Indira, when are you taking a break? Indira, why are you sending an email at 3:00 in the morning, right? And so that helps me to kind of recenter and—
Well, let me just stop you right there. Why are you sending an email at 3 a.m? Do you expect them to be up?
No, I don't expect anybody to be up. It's just my way of getting things off of my to-do list, right? Because my job is so fluid in terms of I can be at the hospital for a 6-hour shift being with a survivor. I could be on hotline, I could be writing a grant, I could be fundraising, right? So it really just varies. And so I think, I tend to, work really late and up early, and I know that's not ideal, so I'm working on it. But yeah, I think it's just a matter of me just doing what I need to do to get it done. But I do not expect people to respond at that time of morning. No. But
and your staff's mental health through all this, and anything in particular you did to help them?
Yeah,
through the last
absolutely.
couple of years?
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I've done as executive director is really create a culture of care within our agency. We really try to prioritize self-care and wellness because we know what this work is. We know that some folks who do this work come to this work because they are survivors. And so we have put things in place in terms of being able to flex your schedule, in terms of being able to take a mental health day. We have amazing health insurance. I call it the American Express of health insurance. And so we encourage folks, take care of your mental health, go to therapy. And what I also do as a leader is I make time to have one-on-one conversations with my staff. And so what I call it is a fireside chat with the executive director. And it's a time for us to, whether we're walking or having lunch or on Zoom, there's no agenda. And I really want them to tell me whatever it is they think I want to know, or not what I want to know, but what they think I need to know. And then I also ask them the question, how are you doing? And more specifically, how is your heart doing? Because the work we do, for me, for our team, it's not hard work, it's heart work. So I'm always asking about their heart. I'm always asking, what do you need from me? What do you need from the agency? How can I support you? We've been working from home as a result of the pandemic. And my first response was, tell me what you need so that you can do your job comfortably and effectively from home. Right? So if you need a better office chair or if you need a desk, let me know and I will buy it. So really trying to be as flexible as possible and really center humanity in the work we do, because there's just no other way to do it.
So you've been executive director for 7 years, if I remember, 6 years.
Yeah.
So how has that question, how have the answers to the question of how's your heart doing changed since COVID? I mean, it's and the racial reckoning. I mean, people must have gotten much deeper, much more hurt, much more insightful.
Yeah, I will. In all transparency, the last 2 years, my heart has been heavy. It's been heavy as a result of just what clients are experiencing. It's been heavy in terms of just what's happening in the environment. And I think for me, as a Black woman leader, I am the only Black woman leader on the acute sexual assault space. And so that in and of itself has its own challenges, which was exacerbated by the racial reckoning. And so I think I have learned a lot within these last 2 years. I have learned skill sets and developed tools that I did not even know exist. And so I think I am so focused on and just grateful that the work I'm doing, although I'm a little tired, I'm excited to do it. And I'm excited to be with clients and be in space with them and make myself available to them. And when I think back to my journey, what I'm very clear about is that when I made the decision to do sexual violence work full time and give up the White House, people thought I was a little bit crazy. My mother asked, what are you thinking? But what I was very clear is that it's important that I do what I'm called to do versus what I'm expected to do. And that has made all the difference, because this is purpose work, right? This is, work that I will be doing on some level for the rest of my life.
I love the way you talk about being your calling. I mean, that's really something.
Absolutely.
It shows the passion you have for it, and as you said, it's something you're going to do for the rest of your life. That's quite a statement to make. So congratulations. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
We've got a couple other questions. One is, what's the type of ongoing training you provide to your people, particularly in light of this world that seems to change every other day, whether it's the COVID, whether it's the racial reckoning, whether it's the war in Ukraine. I mean, there's just
So much.
the inflation now. It's one thing after another here. How do you keep your people prepared to work in a changing world?
Absolutely. So we put a lot of value on professional development. And, it is important to me. I tell them all the time that we should always be in the space of learning. And that we should always be doing professional development work that will allow us to meet the moment in time. And so when things happened around the COVID pandemic and the racial reckoning, we had specialized training for our staff, to really help therapists figure out how to deal with kind of the new things that survivors were coming with in session. We are an agency in terms of our philosophy is that we believe that all forms of oppression are connected. And so, as I mentioned, we work at the intersections. So the way in which we put out programming, the way in which we do training, for us, it always has to have a direct response to racism and oppression. A lot of people don't know we have a long legacy of Black women leadership in our agency, with the exception of one ED. And so we've always been approaching our work from an anti-racist, anti-oppression lens. And so in the midst of this challenging time, it was critical that our staff was getting the support as well as the resources in order to show up in the way that we needed them to.
Yeah, I just want to say, in my work in Montgomery County years ago, with the anthrax attacks, with 9/11, with the sniper shootings, I mean, the people that we had as counselors, as therapists, as people that were relied on to work in the community, we learned that they weren't the right people to do it, because all of a sudden we weren't just dealing with one or two people. We had to have people do it in front of 50, 100, 500 people. So to give training and counseling and all that. And you never know what you're going to need in terms of responding to what's happening out there. So you got to be very flexible, as you just said. So.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point, Doug, because of the way in which, like, in terms of where we are, we're in Washington, D.C., right? So we're in this very unique position because we have the federal folks in our backyard. So when something happens in DC, we are a crisis agency. And so, I am a big believer in, being prepared. So when things went down with the insurrection on Capitol Hill, I got the phone call that, members of Congress were coming out as sexual assault survivors, congressional staff were coming out as sexual assault survivors. And so we created a specialized hotline as well as additional resources to support folks on Capitol Hill who needed additional support. When Dr. Christine Blasey Ford was testifying at the Brett Kavanaugh hearing, we got dispatched to Capitol Hill in order to provide support for hundreds of survivors who had come into DC to show up for Dr. Ford, but who were also being triggered by the testimony and everything going around Supreme Court Justice Kavanaugh. And so our team was on the ground for a week, along with other agencies in the city, providing that support. So that's who we are. We show up in the hard places. We've had boots on the ground the last few months at some of our key DC public schools because of the sexual assault crisis happening there. And so that's what we do at the Rape Crisis Center. Our work is not just internal, but it really is about building the capacity of Washington, DC to respond in a really intentional way.
And what's the size of your budget? How are you able to do all this? What's your budget?
Well, we are in the midst of budget season in DC, but our budget right now is around 1.8.
1.8 million.
Yes.
That's a lot of work for 1.8 million, I got to say. DC's getting a good value for their dollar.
Tell me about it.
Yeah. We'll have to tell the mayor you deserve more funding. How's that? So.
Oh, let's just say the budget. Let's just say the budget testimonies a couple of weeks ago were very interesting. Yes.
But that leads right into another question we have, which is the current role of volunteers, and how so you've got a limited budget, but clearly you rely on volunteers. You started as a volunteer. So what is the current role of volunteers with you all? And it sounds like you're still going into schools and out into the community as well.
Yep, absolutely. So our volunteers are our bread and butter. Our agency started out as volunteers. We could not do our work without volunteers. So right now we have about 95 volunteers. Their main role right now is supporting us on the 24/7 crisis hotline. In addition to that, they are on standby in case there's a crisis in the city and we need to, have multiple hands on deck. They're trained as 24/7 crisis advocates. So when we were on Capitol Hill, they showed up with us. Any kind of major crisis where we have to mobilize quickly, we go into our volunteer pool to help give us backup.
And how many volunteers do you have per year? I mean, how many people?
Well, so right now we have 95, and so we do volunteer trainings 3 times a year. And so that just steadily increases, but also with our volunteers, we have some volunteers who take a hiatus for self-care and mental health wellness. And so it kind of just fluctuates, but on average, we're probably between 80 and 95.
And what's the size of your staff? What's the size of your team?
So our team is growing because I just hired about 8 people, but right now we have about 20, which is pretty big for us. Yeah.
So your volunteers are 4 or 5 to 1 over your paid staff.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, I'm glad you're able to use the volunteers that way. As you said, you couldn't be anywhere close to doing what you do without support.
Absolutely.
We had so I wanted to shift a little bit and talk about leadership some, and what are some of the lessons of leadership that you've relied on, or what do you have any leadership lessons for us that you want to share, particularly in the last couple of years dealing with COVID and all of that?
Yeah, great question, Doug. Wow, leadership lessons. What have I learned? Well, one, I think one of the big ones is leadership is not a spectator sport, right? So too many times, sometimes leaders think that their only role is kind of, just kind of this narrow kind of pathway, but it really is whatever needs to be done, right? And so I have, done things that I never thought that I would be doing just because it needed to be done. And so being clear that leadership is really about service, it's really about public service. I think the other piece is, and I talk about this with my leadership team all the time, is that we can't effectively do this work until we do our own work. And I think that holds true for leaders, right? We all have something, right, to work on. And so it's really important that, we as leaders are humanized and really understand that, we cannot show up in our fullness and in our in our authenticness as a leader on a professional level if we aren't working on whatever we need to work on a personal level, right? And I think that has really become apparent, particularly in the racial reckoning, because, it was a calling out moment for a lot of leaders, right, around the racial reckoning. And, one of the things I talked about a while ago as it relates to that in leaders is that you can't workshop your way out of racism, right? How you show up as a leader impacts the way in which your agency shows up, right? And so in order to do this hard work of, racial justice and all of those things, like you have to do the personal work as well.
So you mentioned earlier that you were the only Black woman in this space. And we have a question.
On the adult side, on the adult side of sexual assault.
So it's a question of what has that been like? What have you had to deal with, and how's that gone for you? And give us some horror stories here.
Ooh, well, I will be careful with my words, but
okay.
But it has been hard. It's been painful. It has made me question, do I have what it takes to do what needs to be done. It's been really hard, really, really hard. When you asked me earlier, how am I doing? And I talked about the heaviness, that's been a part of the heaviness. But again, I have a great support system, and so that has helped. I've had some hard conversations with some of my white colleagues who have made things challenging. And so those have proved to be fruitful and hopeful.
Would you mind sharing an example of that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, when you are a Black woman, a Black woman doing this work, a Black woman in this space, one of the things that I have dealt with and my leadership team has dealt with is the way in which certain spaces in DC wield white privilege and white power. And so the way that people show up in doing this work and the way in which they come to the table, they come to a table knowing that they have power in the space, knowing that they have white privilege, knowing that, they are one of the bigger orgs, right? So it's almost like a David and Goliath, right? And so you're only able to do that because of the white privilege that you hold, right? So the way in which some of my white colleagues show up in the city, in the work, no way I could get away with that. Right? So that's kind of an example. When the standard is different, when I'm applying for funding or a grant and the, criteria or the extra level of scrutiny is more than what somebody would normally do, right? So it's a multitude of things.
And has that been, we're doing a lot on anti-racist leadership in LGW and other things, but during the racial reckoning, which we're still going through, I mean, how did all that impact you personally as you're dealing with these other things, and then society at large?
Yeah, I mean, I think, internally in my organization, of course, did not have any issues or anything like that. I think it was just more so externally. I think showing up to certain spaces where I was the only one was a little bit more challenging than usual. Normally, that's normal, right? And normally I'm fine with that. I think during this season, it proved to be a little extra heavy lift, right? And so I think for me, I was really trying to be intentional around the spaces that I showed up in, wanting to know that I wasn't going to be traumatized, wanting to know that I wasn't going to have to defend something or kind of come across in a certain way, wanting to know that my leadership as a Black woman was not going to be attacked, right? And so I made some very intentional decisions about where I was going to show up, and also told people that if you can't have accountability within the space, then we aren't going to show up, right? Because the work is hard enough, right? And so this is where allyship comes in, right? And so I think that is what has proven to be really hard is, folks who support you or who say they support you, but when something happens in the space, there's dead silence. Right. And so what I believe is that silence is violence. Right. And so I think I had to be very protective of my heart and my, self-preservation. And Doug, there were just some things I just was not going to do anymore. Right. As a result of the racial reckoning, like I didn't have the bandwidth because I was dealing with more pressing needs of my staff, of our clients, of the mission and what we were being called to do in the midst of this pandemic. That took precedent.
In our class this year, the class of 2022, we've had some very interesting discussions with them, and particularly the African-American women in the class are really sort of voicing this thought of, I'm just tired of this. I'm tired of speaking up. I'm tired of of correcting people. I'm tired of, putting up with this stuff, but it's not worth sort of picking a fight with somebody. And it's, in some ways it's a little discouraging, but I understand where they're coming from. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely in agreement. I'm tired of the fight, right?
Yeah.
I'm, tired of explaining, right? Again, it goes back to people have to be willing to do their work, right? You can't effectively do racial justice work and separate yourself from it. It doesn't work like that. And so part of the challenge that we're seeing is that folks are not wanting to do that deep level work. Folks are not wanting to have that accountability, right? Because accountability feels like an attack when you're speaking truths to power, right? And so for me, we have to be able to have a conversation that's rooted in truth, that's rooted in accountability. Because if there's defenses that come up, then there's no path forward because you aren't able to hear kind of what I'm saying. And so I think, all of the kind of racial justice work happening and folks taking all these racial equity classes, it's good, but are you doing the deep level self-evaluation work that needs to happen in order to really show up in a way that leaders in DC are being called to show up in?
And are you willing to have those uncomfortable conversations or be in uncomfortable positions to help get through that? And a lot of people aren't. It kind of reminds me of the NFL. I just, they've got all the right slogans in their end zones, on their helmets, whatever, on their jerseys, but it just, to me, it's just for show. I mean, they don't. Certainly, the leaders of the NFL, my viewpoint, don't seem to believe in that stuff or want that to happen. And because you look at their hiring practices, that tells you right there. So
absolutely, and I think one of the best decisions I ever made, Doug, was becoming a social worker. And I say that because becoming a social worker and the training to become a social worker, you can't effectively do social work without having self-awareness and self-reflection on yourself in terms of how you're experiencing the work, right? So I'm very clear, and I try to be very clear of, being mindful of kind of when I reach my limit, or being mindful of, perhaps I fell short here and this is kind of what I need to do, right? Because I don't always get it right? And so being a social worker really helps to center myself, but also meet people where they are. And, if I need to, acknowledge that I had some shortcomings, I can do that. And it's an ongoing process, right? Because it's a daily practice, but I can't continue to do this work or be doing this work for as long as I have without being able to be mindful of how I'm showing up to the work, how I'm showing up to partners and colleagues and staff. That's important, and that's part of my responsibility as a leader, but also just as a person.
So I worked with someone very closely. We spent a lot of time together who started as a social worker. That was her training. And that's Senator Barbara Mikulski. So are you going to get back into politics and run for office at some point using your social worker training? She said that really made her her training made her such an effective senator. She's a hero of mine. I really loved working with her. But anyway, so are we going to see your name on some campaign posters?
I don't know if running for public office is for me. I'm more of a background trying to help great folks get elected. Don't know if that is my calling. But I do know that I have been really clear, and sexual violence work has been my North Star, right? Because it really just centers me and really gives me a sense of direction in terms of, what is the next level of this work, right? So, yeah.
So how has LGW, how has Leadership Greater Washington or our members supported you the last couple of years since, your class and others? Have you reached out to them for help? Have they reached out to you for help?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. Before I joined LGW, a lot of folks in my circle were LGW. And so when I joined, it just made it even more special. And the last 2 years, LGW has been so important in my self-preservation. I love the folks who I have developed relationships with. And, from my Mind Trust group, Platinum, we go out to dinner once a month. There has been, other folks in LGW, such as Jennifer Lockwood Shabbat and Nikki Gorin and Kira Jarrett and Michelle Booth Cole and Kube and Rosie Allen Heron and Pinky Mayfield, so many others, Debbie Jarvis, who have just not just supported my leadership, but really been supporters of the work of the DC Rape Crisis Center. And, they have been folks who, I definitely know that there are some folks cheering us on, right? And so that's one of the things I love about LGW. It's just the support and folks who want to see you win, folks who will show up for you and do whatever humanly possible for that. And also, Rachel Hornets, our board chair, has been amazing, so just so many people who I feel like, had I not kind of got outside of the DC Rape Crisis Center, probably would not have really, met and been able to engage in a really, really intentional way. So just, so grateful for those folks. And when I started as a leader, folks who, many of those folks who, cheered me on and really encouraged me and gave me pep talks when I needed it, because I wasn't sure if I could do it, right? And just so it was just, great that I could, call folks. I'll never forget, when I first came on board, I had a conversation with Dr. Carolyn Rudd and Marie Johns and, just so many folks who, told me, like, you got this, right? You got this. So it's been really great to feel the support of the leaders in Washington, D.C. And Leadership Greater Washington has been a safety net for me these last 2 years, because it is a community that I can go to with intention and with vulnerability, and just really talk about what's going on. So love it.
No, you just in a few sentences really summed up, I think, the value of LGW. I mean, you listen to the list of women you rattled off, all LGW members, is, that's a huge power base in the city, in the region, and they're all people that you can count on and rely on and go to through and because of LGW. I mean, your list of people it's an extraordinary list. And I just, I'm so proud of Leadership Greater Washington and our members for creating this kind of atmosphere where people are feel free to do that and help each other and look out for each other. And it's all based on making the region a better place. It's all helped on making us all do better. So that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So congratulations to you. That's a
you.
heck of a list.
I mean, and, I think it also speaks to just the power and the breadth of what it means to be an agency that is still standing 50 years, right?
Yep.
So a couple of those folks who I named have been on our board of directors, who have been connected to the center long before I was even thought of, right? And so, that's been really, really important, because, sexual violence work, it's not a sexy issue, right? It doesn't get all the fanfare. It's, it's a really challenging topic for some folks to really engage in. And so I'm just so grateful to the LGW community and, all of those women who I named, and there's so much more, who really value the work that we do and who think that sexual violence work is important and it's something that we need to be talking about as leaders, because there's not a walk of life that sexual violence does not impact. So every leader should be talking about it. Every leader should know that if you have more than 2 employees, you have some survivors in your midst, right? And so how is your agency, how is your organization, how is your company, visibly showing up to support survivors? What does that look like? What is the messaging? And so, that's what I'm really, really grateful for, that sexual violence work doesn't just rest in the DC Rape Crisis Center, but it should be throughout the community.
And we have one final question from our audience, and that is, you mentioned the next level of this work, and they want to know what you meant by that.
Yeah, so I think, as we continue to, move forward and really think about what is the next level, and what I mean by the next level is, what is the next chapter of this work? Where do we go from here, right? It's such a big question, a broad question, a question we've been having on the national level. And, survivors of sexual assault, they are needing more wraparound support. They are needing support systems that are holistic, right? So when survivors come to our agency, yes, we're going to deal with the sexual trauma, but what we also know is that they may have food insecurity issues, they may have housing issues, they may have issues paying their rent, whatever that is. And so for the DC Rape Crisis Center, we have expanded drastically in a very short time, in less than 2 years, in terms of providing wraparound services for survivors. So if a survivor needs long-term support and they say, I need help applying for SSI, or I need help trying to find a place to live, whatever they need on the spectrum, this is where we show up, because we know the work is intersectional. And, historically, that has not necessarily been the case, but we have met the moment in time. And this is where survivors of sexual assault are. And this is where rape crisis centers and other providers who do sexual violence work, this is where we need to be. And this is where we need to continue to build out on.
So Indira, thank you very much for this great conversation. How can we support you? What can we do to help you?
Well, I think, continue to have the conversation around sexual violence. Continue to, cheer us on at the Rape Crisis Center. We have some exciting things coming down the pike for our 50th anniversary. The kickoff is in June, and just so many great things. I would also say that if you're interested in volunteering, we are always taking volunteer applications. If you need support or resources or training, you can definitely reach out to us for that. And if you want to contribute in another way that is meaningful to you, we also welcome that too. So, I think continue to show up and rally around the Rape Crisis Center. We're the only one in DC, oldest one in the country, and let us know how we can support you and your work. And just, keep supporting us.
Well, before we close, I do want to remind everyone that we're putting a evaluation survey in the chat. So please click on that. Please fill it out for us. We're always looking for ways to improve and ways to make it better for all of you. Before I give you the last word, Indira, I do want to say that several of the women you mentioned in your list of tremendous women or from the class of 2015. So I want to thank you for acknowledging the greatness of the class of 2015, which is my class. So I thank you for that. Very nice.
That's funny.
Let me, oh, it's not funny. It's true. Let me give you the final word now, Indira.
I, just want to say thank you again, Doug, for creating this space. Definitely means a lot. My message that I hope folks will remember is that sexual violence is everyone's issue. Everyone should care about it. I hope that people will begin to break down the veil and really have the conversations, have the intergenerational conversations around sexual violence, be able to name it, be able to, expand your language around it. And then, if you or someone is a survivor and needing support, know that there is support and resources out there. And the DC Rape Crisis Center looks forward to continuing to partner with the Washington, DC community in a very intentional way. So thank you all so much.
Indira, thank you for this great conversation. It was fascinating. I really enjoyed it. And to make an announcement, as you enter your 50th anniversary and as we conclude our 35th anniversary, I just want to announce that the DC Rape Crisis Center is LGW's community partner for the year and will be honored at our annual meeting at the end of June. So congratulations to you on that, Indira. I'm very excited about that. That's very nice. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you soon. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.